The Java Sea, February 1942. The world's largest ocean had become a battlefield, and in its depths, the USS Langley met a fate shrouded in confusion and contradiction. Once hailed as America's first aircraft carrier, the Langley AV-3 was no longer the sleek experimental vessel of the 1920s. By the time war reached the Pacific, she had been converted into a seaplane tender, ferrying precious aircraft to the embattled Allied forces defending the Dutch East Indies. Her mission was urgent: to deliver 32 P-40 Warhawks of the U.S. Army Air Forces to the island of Java, a critical stronghold threatened by advancing Japanese troops. On the morning of February 27th, Langley sailed south of Java, escorted by the destroyers USS Whipple and USS Edsall. The tropical air hung thick, heavy with the scent of oil and salt, when lookouts spotted Japanese bombers approaching from the north, 9 twin-engine Mitsubishi G4MS of the Takao Air Group. Commander Robert P. McConnell ordered evasive maneuvers, but the aging carrier was slow to respond. She turned port, zigzagging at barely 15 knots as her 3-inch guns barked into the sky. The men aboard later recalled the whistle of falling bombs, a chorus of steel that grew louder with each pass. At 1,140 hours, 3 direct hits tore through Langley's flight deck. The first ripped open the hangar, igniting a wall of flame that engulfed the stored aircraft fuel. The second smashed through her midsection, killing scores below deck. The third exploded near the engine room, cutting power and steering. "We were blind, burning, and drifting," one sailor later wrote. McConnell ordered abandoned ship shortly after noon. Amid the chaos, lifeboats lowered into oil-stained water as enemy planes circled overhead. Survivors clung to debris, watching their ship, once a proud symbol of American naval innovation, list heavily to port. The destroyers Whipple and Edsall returned hours later to rescue the survivors. To prevent capture, Whipple fired 2 torpedoes into Langley's smoldering hull. The old carrier slipped beneath the waves, leaving only an oil slick and the ghosts of her crew. But this is where the mystery deepens. In the aftermath, conflicting reports emerged. Some claimed the Langley had been struck by 6 bombs. Others said 3. Japanese records, later recovered, listed only minor damage inflicted. Even more puzzling were survivor accounts suggesting that another vessel, possibly the transport SS Seawitch, had been in the vicinity and may have been mistaken for Langley by Japanese bombers. In the confusion of that day, it remains unclear exactly which ship took the fatal hits. Further complicating the record, the U.S. Navy's after-action report contained inconsistencies about the number of men rescued. Some accounts listed 308 survivors, others only 283. Several men reportedly rescued by the Edsall later vanished when that destroyer was sunk 2 days later by a massive Japanese force. Thus, even the identities of those who lived and died aboard Langley blur into uncertainty, a grim example of how easily truth drowns in the fog of war. The sinking of the Langley marked a symbolic moment for the Allies in the Pacific. It was not just the loss of a ship, but the end of an era, the destruction of America's first carrier by the same enemy that had crippled Pearl Harbor months before. Yet, the ship's disappearance also exposed the logistical desperation of early 1942. Poor coordination, inadequate reconnaissance, and rushed deployment of unescorted convoys had left vulnerable vessels scattered across the Indonesian archipelago. Japanese superiority in the air and sea was absolute. The fall of Singapore had cut British defenses, and the Dutch East Indies were collapsing under relentless assault. The Langley's mission, to deliver fighters to Java, was doomed from the start. But her crew carried out their duty regardless, navigating through hostile skies to deliver aircraft that would never see combat. It was courage in the face of inevitability. In recent years, underwater surveys have searched the approximate site of her sinking, somewhere 75 miles south of Cilacap. Despite numerous expeditions, no confirmed wreckage of the USS Langley has ever been identified. Some suggest the ship lies in pieces scattered by wartime demolition. Others believe the true site remains misreported. Naval archives from the time show coordinates that shift by as much as 20 miles, small errors in the chaos of retreat, but enough to obscure the truth for generations. Perhaps the greatest mystery of the Langley is not how she sank, but how her story faded from public memory. She was America's first carrier, the vessel that helped forge the doctrine of naval aviation, yet her destruction passed almost unnoticed in the larger tragedy of the Pacific War. Her crew's sacrifice and the strange disappearance of her wreck stand as reminders of the countless fragments of history still missing beneath the waves. As the Pacific grew darker in 1942, one ship's death became another's warning. And just weeks later, the British Royal Navy would experience its own disaster at sea, a sudden assault in the Indian Ocean that would test the limits of Allied intelligence and reveal another chapter of wartime mystery. April 1942, the Indian Ocean was on fire. The British Royal Navy, still reeling from the fall of Singapore and the loss of Prince of Wales and Repulse just months earlier, faced a new and terrifying threat: the full might of the Imperial Japanese Navy. For centuries, Britain had ruled these waters unchallenged. But that spring, Admiral Sir James Somerville's Eastern Fleet found itself vastly outnumbered, outgunned, and caught off guard by an enemy that had mastered the element of surprise. The Japanese operation, codenamed Sea, was designed to destroy British naval power in the Indian Ocean and isolate Australia. Under the command of Admiral Chichi Nagumo, the same man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, a formidable task force of 5 carriers, 4 battleships, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers swept westward from Singapore. Their targets: the British bases at Colombo and Trincomalee on the island of Ceylon, now modern-day Sri Lanka. In their path lay the cruisers HMS Cornwall and HMS Dorsetshire, both veterans of the Atlantic and Indian Oceans, unaware that they were about to vanish into wartime legend. At dawn on April 5, 1942, Japanese reconnaissance aircraft spotted British shipping off Colombo. Within hours, dive bombers descended in waves, turning the harbor into a furnace of steel and smoke. The carrier HMS Hermes narrowly escaped the first attack, but the British fleet was in disarray. Somerville's fleet had retreated south, fearing an ambush. His ships, spread over hundreds of miles, had little communication, a fatal error in a war where seconds mattered. Among them, Cornwall and Dorsetshire were steaming toward rendezvous when they received a frantic radio message: "Enemy carrier sighted. Proceed south at full speed." By noon, it was too late. 80 Japanese aircraft from the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Hiryu, and Soria descended from the clouds. Witnesses described the sky as a swarm of locusts, sunlight flashing off the bombers' wings as they dove with precision honed from months of combat. The British ships had no air cover. Their anti-aircraft guns chattered uselessly as the first bombs struck home. Within minutes, both cruisers were engulfed in flames. The Dorsetshire took several direct hits amidships. Cornwall's engine room was destroyed. At 13:40, both ships rolled over and sank within 10 minutes of each other, leaving nearly 1,200 men struggling in burning oil and open sea. Survivor accounts reveal scenes of chaos and courage. Men clung to rafts, some singing hymns to keep from panicking, others reciting their last prayers. The sea was alive with wreckage and fire. One sailor recalled, "You could feel the heat of the burning oil even as you treaded water." Hours later, the destroyer HMS Enterprise arrived and rescued 1,122 survivors, an extraordinary number, considering the violence of the attack. Yet even in survival, questions lingered. How had the Japanese known exactly where the British cruisers would be? Post-war analysis suggests that Japanese reconnaissance aircraft had intercepted British wireless transmissions days before, giving them the precise location of the fleet. Others point to the possibility of broken British codes or compromised intelligence from within Ceylon itself. Churchill's post-war memoirs allude cryptically to an intelligence oversight of grave proportions, but the details remain sealed in British archives. The question persists: was the loss of Cornwall and Dorsetshire simply bad luck, or the result of a deeper intelligence failure? Adding to the mystery, later Japanese logs described striking 2 additional enemy ships south of the primary target area, vessels that the British never officially acknowledged losing. Some historians speculate these were misidentified shadows or smoke reflections on the horizon. Others propose they may have been Allied supply ships traveling under false registry, whose existence was deliberately omitted from wartime records to conceal logistical routes. No wrecks corresponding to those phantom ships have ever been found. The Indian Ocean raid was more than a naval defeat. It was a psychological one. For the first time, the Royal Navy's dominance of the world's oceans was openly challenged and shattered by an Asian power. Somerville's fleet retreated to East Africa, and Ceylon was left virtually defenseless. Japan now held sway over the Indian Ocean's vital sea lanes, if only temporarily. The British Empire had been forced to look into the abyss, the realization that its empire could be attacked anywhere, at any time. In the aftermath, British officials struggled to piece together the events. Eyewitness testimonies conflicted on the sequence of the bombing runs. Japanese reports claimed near-perfect coordination, yet aerial photographs showed erratic bomb patterns, suggesting that at least part of the attack force may have been targeting decoys or misidentified vessels. The chaos of battle obscured truth as effectively as the smoke that covered the sea. One report from an RAF observer stationed in Colombo noted a strange flicker of radio signals moments before the attack, brief, coded transmissions in an unknown frequency band. Some theorists later speculated these signals could have been Japanese spotter transmissions or even attempts by Allied intelligence to warn the fleet. Whatever their origin, they went unheeded. And by the time the sun set on April 5th, the British had lost 2 cruisers, hundreds of men, and the illusion of safety in the Indian Ocean. The survivors were eventually brought to port at Adu Atoll, many suffering from burns, exposure, and shock. Their accounts would feed both official reports and whispered rumors among Allied sailors that the enemy always seemed to know where they were, that something or someone was leaking their every move. As one survivor grimly wrote in his diary, "It was as if they could see us before we even saw them." The Royal Navy would regroup and learn from this disaster. But the seeds of suspicion sown during the Indian Ocean raid would linger, setting the stage for the next great naval encounter of the war, one where the tables would finally turn, but not without its own share of strange decisions and hidden motives. December 31st, 1942, in the icy waters of the Barents Sea, night never truly fell. The sun hovered low on the horizon, casting a dim, ghostly light across the Arctic expanse. On this New Year's Eve, a British convoy known as JW-51B pressed eastward toward Murmansk, carrying vital supplies for the Soviet war effort. Around it sailed a small escort of Royal Navy destroyers and 2 light cruisers, HMS Sheffield and HMS Jamaica, under the command of Rear Admiral Robert Burnett. They were exhausted, frozen, and unaware that a powerful German fleet was closing in, determined to annihilate them before the year's end. This would become known as the Battle of the Barents Sea, a clash fought in near darkness, amid snow squalls and howling wind, where confusion reigned supreme. The German force, commanded by Vice Admiral Oskar Kumetz, included the heavy cruiser Admiral Hipper, the pocket battleship Lutzow, and 6 destroyers, vastly superior firepower to the British escorts. The plan was simple: attack at dawn, destroy the convoy, and deliver Hitler a symbolic victory to close 1942. But history would record something stranger, an engagement marked not by triumph, but by hesitation, misjudgment, and inexplicable retreat. At 8:50 hours, the destroyer HMS Obdrat picked up radar contacts approaching fast from the southwest. Within minutes, the British formation erupted into action. Through sleet and snow, Hipper's silhouette emerged like a phantom. Her 8-inch guns opened fire, shells screaming over the frozen sea. The British destroyers laid smoke and darted in for torpedo attacks, using agility to compensate for lack of power. HMS Onslow, the lead destroyer, took multiple hits, killing her captain and crippling her steering. Yet, despite severe damage, she continued to fight, a desperate dance of survival against overwhelming odds. Admiral Burnett, stationed aboard HMS Sheffield, ordered his cruisers to engage. At 10 o'clock, Sheffield's guns found their mark, striking Hipper's superstructure and knocking out her radar. In those chaotic moments, confusion spread through the German line. Reports came in of unidentified ships closing from the north, contacts that some officers described as heavy units. In truth, they were likely radar echoes from Burnett's smaller escorts or even phantom returns caused by snow interference. But the effect was immediate. Kumetz hesitated, convinced he faced the main British home fleet. The German attack began to unravel. On the bridge of Admiral Hipper, officers argued about whether to press the assault or withdraw. Radio messages crackled from Berlin, urging caution. Unknown to the men on deck, Hitler himself had been micromanaging naval operations from afar, furious at what he saw as the Kriegsmarine's repeated failures. No more risks, he had ordered days before. The surface fleet must not be lost. This command, combined with poor visibility and faulty radar, created a paralysis of action that cost Germany dearly. By midday, despite holding every tactical advantage, Kumetz ordered a withdrawal, a decision that would send shockwaves through the German Navy. Meanwhile, the convoy, battered but intact, pushed onward through the storm. Out of the 15 merchant ships, all reached their destination. It was a miraculous survival, one achieved through courage, improvisation, and perhaps sheer confusion on the part of the enemy. The British had scored a defensive victory, yet even in triumph, the battle left unanswered questions. Post-war analysis of the German war diary revealed a series of puzzling entries. Radar operators aboard the Lutzow reported tracking 2 large capital ships at a bearing northwest of their position, vessels that never existed. Their presence, real or imagined, directly influenced Kumetz's decision to retreat. Some historians suggest this was an early instance of radar ghosting, where atmospheric interference in Arctic conditions created false echoes. Others wonder if British intelligence deliberately transmitted misleading signals, part of an emerging field of electronic warfare. The truth remains uncertain. One British officer, Commander Jack McCoy of HMS Obedient, later wrote in his report, "We fought not only the enemy but the sea itself, and something else unseen, shaping both sides' choices." His cryptic comment has intrigued naval historians for decades. The something else unseen may have referred simply to weather, but it also hinted at the strange, almost psychological fog that enveloped both fleets, where perception became as deadly as gunfire. The consequences of this engagement were profound. When news of the defeat reached Berlin, Hitler was enraged. He summoned Grand Admiral Erich Raeder to his headquarters and, in a furious tirade, accused the Kriegsmarine of cowardice and incompetence. "Our ships hide like moles in the sea," he shouted. Days later, he ordered the disbandment of Germany's surface fleet and shifted focus entirely to U-boat warfare. Raeder resigned shortly after, replaced by Karl Donitz. The Battle of the Barents Sea had changed the course of the naval war, not through destruction, but through the power of misjudgment. Yet the mystery endures. How did seasoned German commanders misread their radar so catastrophically? Why did they report ships that weren't there? The answers lie buried in fragments of signal logs and weather data, much of it lost during the war's final months. Some surviving German officers, interviewed after 1945, admitted they never fully understood what happened that day. "We saw what we believed," one recalled, "and believed what we feared." For the Royal Navy, the Barents Sea was a hard-earned redemption, proof that discipline and daring could overcome superior firepower. For Germany, it was an omen of decline. But for historians, it remains one of the most curious episodes of World War II, a battle won not only by courage, but by confusion, where the line between fact and illusion blurred across a frozen sea. As 1943 dawned, the Allies turned their gaze westward again, to the storm-lashed Atlantic, where convoys faced their most relentless enemy yet, the silent predators of the deep. And in that struggle, new mysteries would emerge from the depths, cloaked in fog, fear, and radio silence. The North Atlantic, May 1943, the ocean was a graveyard of steel. Merchant convoys snaked across the gray waves, carrying food, ammunition, and oil to Britain, lifelines in the Battle of the Atlantic. For years, German U-boats had hunted them relentlessly, sinking thousands of tons of Allied shipping. But by spring of 1943, the hunters were becoming the hunted. The battle for Convoy ONS 5 would mark a turning point, and yet it would also leave behind one of the most puzzling mysteries of the war at sea. Convoy ONS 5 left Liverpool on April 21, 1943, bound for Halifax, Nova Scotia. 42 slow merchant ships formed its core, guarded by a dozen British and Canadian escorts under the command of Captain Robert Sherbrooke aboard HMS Duncan. They carried precious supplies and soldiers returning home after service in North Africa. The weather turned foul almost immediately. Heavy gales tore through the convoy, scattering ships across miles of dark water. Radar and sonar were hampered by interference. In those conditions, both sides, Allied and German, would soon lose track not only of their enemy, but of themselves. Lurking below the surface was the Wolfpack Star, a formation of nearly 30 German U-boats commanded by Admiral Karl Donitz. Their orders were simple: destroy the convoy. For several nights, the submarines stalked the Allied ships through heavy fog and freezing rain. The convoy's defenders, including HMS Vedette and the Canadian corvette HMCS Snowflake, struggled to maintain contact. "We were blind out there," one officer recalled. "The fog swallowed everything: the sky, the sea, even the sound of our own engines." On the night of May 4th, the attack began. Flares lit the sky as torpedoes streaked into the convoy. Within minutes, 5 merchantmen were ablaze. The escort ships responded with depth charges, their concussions rolling like thunder beneath the sea. Amid the chaos, a strange pattern emerged in the radio logs. Multiple Allied ships reported seeing unidentified destroyers approaching from the west, vessels flashing signal lamps but not responding to recognition codes. Some claimed the mystery ships opened fire on nearby U-boats. Others insisted they simply appeared and vanished in the mist. No Allied destroyers were recorded in that sector. German reports add to the puzzle. Several U-boat commanders, including Captain Lieutenant Heinrich Bleikrad of U-109, later wrote of enemy destroyers emerging suddenly from fog without radar detection. U-264's log recorded torpedoing what its crew believed was a British destroyer, only to find no debris, no oil slick, nothing. Post-war analyses found no Allied losses matching those encounters. Naval historians have long debated what these phantom ships could have been: mirages caused by searchlights and smoke, reflections on radar, or misidentified convoy escorts operating without proper signal discipline. But the frequency of the sightings remains extraordinary, nearly a dozen independent reports from both sides. As dawn broke on May 5th, the storm intensified. Waves topped 30 feet, breaking over the decks of destroyers. The convoy scattered further, forcing Captain Sherbrooke to issue the desperate order: every ship for itself. Reassemble at daylight. The Wolfpack pressed its advantage, sinking 7 more merchant ships. But in the early hours of May 6, something changed. Allied radar detected multiple U-boats breaking off pursuit. Radio intercepts from German command stations recorded abrupt silence from 5 submarines. All lost contact within minutes of one another. Their wrecks have never been found. The official explanation attributes these disappearances to aggressive counterattacks by escort vessels. Depth charges dropped in poor visibility. Yet the recorded positions of those attacks do not align with the last known coordinates of the missing U-boats. In one instance, HMS Duncan's sonar operator reported a metallic echo moving at high speed on an impossible bearing, 40 knots, far beyond what any submarine could achieve. "It passed beneath us like a whisper," the report read. And then the contact was gone. By the end of the engagement, 11 Allied ships had been lost, but the Germans suffered catastrophic losses as well. At least 6 U-boats were confirmed sunk, and several others simply disappeared. The surviving German commanders, shaken and confused, reported hearing unidentified pings and false signals on their hydrophones, ghost sonar, that seemed to come from every direction. U-boat radio logs recovered after the war reveal a chilling note: enemy devices unknown. Sound waves inhuman. It was likely early sonar interference, but to those who lived it, it felt like an invisible hand turning the tide. Convoy ONS 5 limped into Halifax on May 12th. Of its 42 ships, 31 arrived intact. For the Allies, it was a turning point, proof that new radar, sonar, and air patrol tactics could break the U-boat threat. For the Germans, it was the beginning of the end of the Wolfpack era. Yet, decades later, researchers poring over naval archives found gaps that still defy explanation. Several radio transmissions from U-boats in the area were intercepted, but their origins did not match known call signs. One message, decoded only partially, read simply, "We are not alone in this sector." Theories abound. Some believe the unidentified ships were radar echoes, a byproduct of atmospheric ducting in the violent storm. Others suggest they were secret Allied vessels testing early electronic warfare, their identities erased from records. A few German officers, interviewed in the 1950s, insisted they saw what appeared to be American destroyers, though the U.S. Navy had none in that region at the time. Whatever the truth, those fog-shrouded nights of May 1943 remain one of the Atlantic's enduring mysteries. In the years that followed, ONS 5 would be studied as a textbook example of convoy defense, but among the men who survived, it was remembered differently. "We beat the Wolfpack," one sailor said, "but there were other things out there that night, things we couldn't explain." The Battle of the Atlantic was turning in favor of the Allies, but across the Pacific, the largest naval confrontation in human history was approaching. And within that massive clash, the Battle of Leyte Gulf lay yet another enigma that would haunt military historians for decades, the day an entire Japanese fleet turned away from victory. October 1944, the Pacific Ocean had become the stage for the largest naval battle in human history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf would decide not only the fate of the Philippines, but the future of the entire Pacific War. Across 1,000 miles of sea, more than 200,000 sailors fought in 4 distinct engagements. Yet within this vast clash lies one of the war's greatest puzzles, the moment when an unstoppable Japanese armada turned back at the brink of victory, a decision that still defies full explanation. It began with the Allied invasion of Leyte Island on October 20th, 1944. General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines, fulfilling his famous promise. To oppose him, Japan launched Operation Shogo, a desperate counterattack designed to annihilate the American landing forces. The plan was complex. Multiple Japanese fleets would converge on Leyte Gulf, striking from different directions to trap and destroy the U.S. invasion armada. The centerpiece of the Japanese counteroffensive was the Center Force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita. It included the battleships Yamato and Musashi, the largest ever built, along with cruisers and destroyers, nearly 30 ships in all. On October 24th, in the Sibuyan Sea, U.S. aircraft from Admiral Halsey's carriers located and attacked Kurita's fleet. The airstrikes were ferocious. Hundreds of bombs and torpedoes tore into the Musashi, which sank after hours of relentless assault. Kurita, stunned and shaken, temporarily turned his fleet away. Yet by nightfall, he reversed course, determined to press on toward Leyte. He had lost one of Japan's greatest battleships, but the mission, to reach and destroy the American beachhead, was not yet over. As Kurita's fleet moved through the San Bernardino Strait, fate and confusion intervened. Halsey, commanding the U.S. Third Fleet, believed the main Japanese force lay to the north. Convinced that decoy carriers under Admiral Ozawa were the real threat, Halsey pursued them, leaving the San Bernardino Strait unguarded. It was an error that opened the path for Kurita's massive armada to surge straight toward Leyte and straight toward a small, thinly armed American escort group, Task Unit April 3rd, 77, codenamed Taffy 3. Taffy 3 was never meant for direct combat. Composed of 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts, its job was to provide air support for ground troops, not fight battleships. But at dawn on October 25th, Lookouts aboard the escort carrier Fanshawe Bay spotted dark shapes on the horizon. Within minutes, the sea erupted in fire. Shells from Yamato and Congo screamed overhead, their shockwaves shattering bulkheads. "This is a fight for survival," radioed Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague. "Enemy battleships are upon us." What followed was one of the most heroic and baffling naval actions in modern warfare. Taffy 3's destroyers, hopelessly outgunned, turned to attack. USS Johnston, commanded by Commander Ernest Evans, charged through smoke and shellfire to launch torpedoes at the oncoming Japanese fleet. "We're going in," Evans shouted. "No one else can close the range." His attack, followed by those of Hull and Heermann, threw Kurita's formation into disarray. Shells from the Japanese heavy cruisers struck the tiny U.S. ships, tearing them apart, yet the Americans kept fighting. From the escort carriers, Avengers and Wildcats launched continuous strikes, dropping bombs and making strafing runs even after exhausting ammunition. The sea became chaos, smoke, fire, confusion, and courage beyond reason. Japanese reports describe what appeared to be multiple large aircraft carriers and heavy cruisers engaging them, ships that didn't exist. Allied pilots flying overhead dropped smoke screens that reflected radar returns, amplifying the illusion. In the midst of this confusion, Kurita hesitated. His flagship, Yamato, was hit by near misses, while several of his cruisers suffered crippling damage. The admiral later described the scene as a battle fought against ghosts. Unsure of the enemy's strength, and fearing he faced Halsey's main fleet, he made the fateful decision at 9:20 to withdraw. The Japanese had come within striking distance of the unprotected American landing forces at Leyte. Had Kurita pressed his attack for just a few more hours, he might have inflicted catastrophic losses. Instead, his fleet turned north, disappearing back through the San Bernardino Strait. The men of Taffy 3 watched in disbelief as the enemy retreated. "They're leaving," one officer shouted. "My God, they're actually leaving." Post-war analyses have struggled to explain Kurita's decision. His own testimony offers only fragments of reasoning, confusion about enemy strength, lack of communications, and concern over air attacks. Yet some accounts from surviving officers mention unexplained radio intercepts, transmissions suggesting a larger American force was approaching from east, signals that Allied commanders later denied sending. Radar logs from Yamato's operations room show ghost contacts to the north, moving fast and closing rapidly. These phantom readings may have convinced Kurita he was walking into a trap. Historians continue to debate whether Kurita's withdrawal was rational caution or tragic misjudgment. Japanese historian H. Hara described it as the moment Japan lost the sea forever. To many veterans, it was something more elusive, a convergence of fear, exhaustion, and miscommunication that turned the tide of history. Even American survivors spoke of the surreal confusion. Lieutenant Robert Hagan of USS Heermann later said, "We were sure we were dead. Then suddenly, the fire stopped. It was like the sea itself had chosen to let us live." By the time the smoke cleared, Taffy 3 had lost 3 destroyers, 1 destroyer escort, and 2 carriers. Yet their sacrifice had saved tens of thousands of lives on Leyte. The Japanese Navy, crippled and demoralized, would never recover. The battle stands as both a triumph and an enigma, proof that courage can shape fate, but also that war's greatest mysteries often arise not from deception, but from the human mind under unbearable pressure. As the wrecks of Johnston and Gambier Bay lay silent beneath the Philippine Sea, another chapter of maritime mystery began to unfold, not in the Pacific, but in the closing months of the war, when entire vessels vanished without trace, leaving behind only rumors, fragments, and unanswered questions in the final twilight of World War II. May 1945, the guns of Europe had fallen silent, but the war at sea was not yet over. Across the Atlantic, the remnants of the German Kriegsmarine scattered like ghosts, their commanders facing a grim choice: surrender or disappear. Amid this chaos, one submarine slipped through Allied patrols and emerged weeks later in a place no one expected: Argentina. Its number was U-530, and its arrival on July 10, 1945, would ignite one of the last and most enduring mysteries of World War II. U-530 was a Type IXC-40 U-boat built for long-range patrols. Under the command of Oberleutnant Otto Wermuth, it had sailed from Kiel in February 1945, assigned to intercept Allied convoys in the North Atlantic. But by the time it reached its patrol area, Germany was collapsing. Hitler was dead, Berlin had fallen, and the U-boat command had issued unconditional surrender orders. Yet Wermuth did not respond. For weeks, U-530 remained unaccounted for, and when she finally surfaced off Mar del Plata, Argentina, she was far from any recorded operational zone. The Argentine Navy was stunned. The war in Europe had ended more than 2 months earlier. U-530's crew, weary and silent, surrendered without resistance. No cargo, no passengers, no papers. The ship's logbook had been destroyed, the deck gun jettisoned, and torpedoes discharged. Wermuth claimed they had sunk none. When interrogated by Allied intelligence, he insisted that U-530 had fled to the South Atlantic to avoid capture and decided to surrender to a neutral country rather than fall into Allied hands. It was a plausible story, but one riddled with inconsistencies. For one, the timeline didn't add up. To reach Argentina from the North Atlantic would have taken roughly 3 weeks at best speed, yet U-530 appeared more than 70 days after Germany's surrender. Where had she been? The submarine's fuel reserves couldn't account for such a prolonged voyage without refueling. Nor could her crew explain their exact route. When pressed, Wermuth's answers grew evasive. "We followed orders, then received none," he said. "We waited where we were told to wait." Rumors filled the void. Newspapers across South America speculated that U-530 had carried high-ranking Nazi officials to secret refuges in Patagonia, or even that Hitler himself had escaped aboard her. Allied investigators dismissed such claims as fantasy, but the mystery deepened when another U-boat, U-977, surrendered in Argentina just weeks later. Both submarines had arrived with their logs destroyed, both far beyond their operational limits, both silent about their true missions. Were they acting independently, or following a hidden directive issued in the final days of the Reich? Declassified British naval intelligence files suggest that Allied signals units in the South Atlantic intercepted faint U-boat transmissions in late May 1945, long after the official surrender order. The signals came from positions between Ascension Island and the Rio de la Plata, an area where no U-boats were supposed to be operating. Efforts to triangulate the source failed. When U-530 appeared soon after, some in the Admiralty quietly speculated that she had rendezvoused with other German vessels or support ships, perhaps to offload sensitive materials or passengers. Yet, no definitive proof ever surfaced. Investigators who boarded U-530 found her surprisingly clean. Her bilges were dry, the machinery well-maintained, and her provisions mostly intact. It was as if she had not spent months at sea but weeks. "The condition of the vessel does not correspond with the commander's account," wrote one U.S. naval attaché. "There are indications of recent resupply, though no tender has been identified." The ship's diesel filters were fresh, an impossibility unless replaced at sea or at a hidden port. In Argentina, public fascination grew. Reporters dubbed it the ghost submarine. Locals swore they had seen other vessels offshore days before the surrender, fast-moving, dark silhouettes that vanished into the horizon. Theories ranged from hidden Antarctic bases to secret German convoys smuggling treasure, technology, or personnel out of Europe. The truth was likely simpler but no less mysterious. Somewhere in those final weeks, U-530 and others like her operated beyond the chain of command, their motives lost with the Reich's collapse. For the crew, the interrogations were grueling. None broke. Wermuth maintained his account until his death. They had fled north after a failed patrol, then south to surrender. No war crimes, no passengers, no hidden orders. Yet Allied intelligence officers noted the unity of their testimonies, too rehearsed, too identical. One U.S. officer wrote, "They tell the truth they agreed upon, not the one they lived." Years later, documents recovered from German archives hinted at Operation Regenbogen, an order for U-boats to scuttle themselves rather than surrender. Yet U-530 did not.
Why?
Was it defiance, or was there something aboard worth preserving? The submarine was eventually transferred to the United States, examined, and sunk as a target off New England in 1947. Whatever secrets she held went down with her. To this day, U-530's missing weeks remain unexplained. No logbooks, no intercepts, no survivors willing to speak. She joins a small but haunting list of wartime vessels that vanished and reappeared, reminders that even in a conflict documented to the smallest detail, the sea keeps its silence. And so ends this chronicle of the forgotten mysteries of the Second World War, 5 naval battles, and disappearances that history remembers only in fragments. From the burning skies over Java to the ghost ships of the Atlantic, each story reveals the same truth. War is not only fought with steel and fire, but with uncertainty. The ocean, vast and impartial, swallows evidence, leaving behind only questions. These are the echoes that remain, not of heroes or villains, but of moments when the fog of war thickened into legend. Beneath the calm waters of peace, those wrecks still rest, their stories unfinished, their signals faint, waiting, perhaps, for one last message to be heard.